Hey fellow gliders, welcome back. Today we are going to discuss row owners and user-specific columns and what the difference is between the two, which use cases you would use one over the other in your app. Now, both features do offer a bit of personalization and data security, but there are definite use cases where you'd use one over the other. Now, before we dive into either one of those, we need to first take a look at the user profile table. The user profile table also offers a bit of personalization because you're able to bring in a value from the user profile table into any other table in your app. For example, I can dive into any of these other tables and I can add a column, such as the template column, where I can bring in a user profile value. And then it'll populate this value across every single row in the app. So if you wanted to bring in personalized information from the user profile table into any of your other tables, that's how you would do it. You would leverage the user profile table. Now, whenever you create a new app in Glide, it's always going to create a users table for you, and it will place row owners on the email column of that user profile table. So let's first talk about row owners. So what is row owners? A row owner is basically a security measure that allows you to segment your data from every other user. When you place row owners on an email column, then only that signed in user will have access to that row. So for example, I'm signed in right now as me. This is my email address. I have row owners placed on the email address column. So that means the app knows who I am and will find any row that has my email address and make it available to me and make all of the other rows unavailable. It's as though they don't even exist. In the builder, you can see that they're grayed out. That lets the builder know that those rows will not be visible to the person that you're previewing as. So if I were to preview the app as person 1, you see that they're highlighted and all of the other rows are grayed out. Okay. Now, as the app builder, I can see all of the data, right? I can see all 4 users worth of data here, right? But if I were to sign into the app with any of these email addresses, it's as though the other 3 don't even exist. If you were to bring up some sort of specialty tool to inspect the database that's feeding the app, you would see only your information. It's as though the other pieces of data never exists because those rows will never get downloaded to your device. So not only is it a security measure, right, that data doesn't exist to the signed in user, but it's also a way to optimize your app. If you have an app which has a table which has thousands of rows in it, but those rows are specific only to the signed in user, then it's a good idea to place row owners on that table so that way you have less data being downloaded to the app, which will make it run faster. Now, the only reason why you would not want to place row owners on a table that has user data is if users should be able to see the other user's information. If I were building some sort of app that has a community aspect to it, I would want a person in my app to see another person's information. I want to see their photo and their name and how many likes they have and all the other fun things, right? However, you do have to be cautious about how you build out that functionality. My recommendation is that you still place row owners on the users table because the users table has sensitive information in it like email addresses, possible phone numbers and addresses and things like that. And then you would build out a separate public profiles table that includes less sensitive information. Their name, their user ID, and their photo, things like that. If you want more information about how to build a user profile table versus a public profile table, I already have a video on that. I'll link it in the description below, or you can click right over here to see that video. But otherwise, we're going to move on and talk about how to place row owners on a table. Now, we've already mentioned that you can place row owners on an email address column. Majority of the time, that's what you're going to do, right? You're going to have some sort of table that has email addresses in it, and you're going to make that a row owner, so then that way people can't see each other's data, right? The users table already has that. Let's say I was creating a tasks app, and I want to only view my own tasks. And I know that for the purpose of this app, I will never need to see somebody else's tasks. It's not some sort of social community task app, right? It's a personalized task app. What I could do is I could create a table here with tasks, right? Here's task 1 that I created. And whenever I create a task, I'm also going to add the email address of the person who added that task. So I would create a column here called email, and I'd make it a type of email. And then I can place row owners on the email column. All right. So if I were to do task 1 here, you see that I don't have access to it because my email is not tied to it. But once I tie my email to that task, now it becomes available to me. Right? So how we would do this on the front end of your app is you would create some sort of interface that has access to those tasks. So here's my list of tasks here. And this collection is going to view all of the tasks. Okay. And when I go to create a new task, I wouldn't have to ask for the email. I would just write in the user profile table email. So I would collect the user's email address as part of that form. All right, so here's task number 2. All right, so now I see task 1 and I see task 2 in my task app. But if I were signed in as any other user, those tasks don't exist, right? That information wouldn't even get downloaded to the device. Again, super secure and makes your app more efficient. Now, what if I were to build more of a social task app where it would be okay to see other people's tasks? What would be the best practices there? Here's how I would go about doing that. Right? Instead of writing their email address, which could be sensitive information, we don't want to give away our email addresses or expose that information. Instead, what I would do is I would add in some sort of non-sensitive or insensitive, non-sensitive information that was still an identifier to the person who is signed in. So in that case, I would use row IDs. So in the users table, what I would do is I would go ahead and add in a row ID. Okay, this row ID is just some random characters. It's not exposing any sort of sensitive data here, right? And instead of writing the email address of the person, I would write in the user ID of that person. Now, if we also wanted to capture the person's name and photo, right? This user ID, I could relate it back to some sort of public user table, which I talked about in that video previously, or you can just write those values as well, right? I can write in the person's name and maybe the person's photo of that task image. Okay. So now when I create a new task, right, I'll capture the user profile. I'll capture the row ID to go to the user ID, the name to the name, and the photo to the image column here. So here's my new task. Okay. And now it doesn't matter who I'm signed in as, they will see that person's task. All right, here's person 2's task. It doesn't matter who I'm signed in as. Now, one mistake that I see often with new Glide builders is that they'll attempt to filter a collection based on some sort of user information and think that that's good enough. So here I have a collection. Here's person 2, and maybe we only want to show person 2's things, right, if you're signed in as that user. So they would filter the collection to where the user ID of that task is the person that signed in, is the user profile row ID, right? And it seems like it works fairly well, right? Here's person 2 is signed into the app, they see their task, and if person 1 or person 3 are signed into the app, they won't see the task, which is true. Visibly, they won't see that information. However, it's not a security feature. Filtering still allows all of the data to be downloaded to the device. So if you want to secure your data, you have to use row owners. You can't just use filters. Now let's go ahead and pivot and talk about user-specific columns. User-specific columns is another way to offer a personalized experience to your end users where they can type in some information or store some value somewhere that's meaningful to them without any other user of the app seeing that data. right? Now, row owners is talking about rows of data, where user-specific columns are talking about columns of data, right? So let's say, for example, I have these 3 tasks. And these are tasks maybe I want every user to complete as part of the onboarding process to this app, right? Every user should have their own version of these 3 tasks. If I want each person to check off these tasks using only these 3 rows, I have to use user-specific columns. So what I could do here is I could add a new column here. We can make it a Boolean column, like a checkbox, right? But then I make it user-specific. So if I make it user-specific, one thing we notice is that the icon for that column turns blue. And then if I were to check this box, right, only person 1 right now is checking this box. If I were viewing as person 2, we see the box is unchecked. They have their own version of that cell of that column. Okay, so again, all of that checking of the boxes and writing of the values to a user-specific column is done on the user's device. Okay, but again, likewise, if I am the app builder, I could certainly preview the app as any user and see what things have been checked, right? Those values still live on Glide servers somewhere, so then that way I, as an app builder, can see the user's information. But any other user won't see that person's information. All right, so how I'd build this out on the front end of the app is I would create a screen. Let's call it from these user-specific tasks, right? And we have this list of tasks here. And then we can allow our users to check off these tasks. I can create an action or a button somewhere on this screen as collection item action, right, which allows them to mark it as done. Right, I could set a column value in this item, which is that row, and mark it true. All right, so I could say this one's done, right, and this one's done. You see they're being marked as true right now, and on the back end, we see that those have been checked. Right, but that's just for this user. Every other user gets their own version, right? So person 2 hasn't marked anything true yet. Right? User-specific columns are just that. They're user-specific, which means every other user of the app will never see the values that I'm writing to those checkboxes, right? So if you wanted to allow a user to like a post here like this, let's say, right, and have it be marked as liked, then no other user is going to be able to see that. It's user-specific. So if you wanted to build out some sort of social liking kind of platform deal, you'd have to use some sort of combination of both user-specific columns and basic columns. Now, another misconception that I see happen often for novice app builders is that they feel that they need to use user-specific columns for any sort of table that has user data in it. So for example, if I were to go back to this idea of the tasks app, right? Often what I'll see is that they'll create this tasks table where the task is user specific and the person who is creating the task, the email address here is user specific, and maybe the timestamp of when they completed the task or when they created the task, that's also user specific, like this, right? They say, oh, this is user information, right? Belongs to this user here, so it has to be user specific. But that's actually not the case. It's faulty logic. This is actually not going to work either. Let me show you why. If I were to create a new screen off of that, off of that table, and we wanted to create that task list again here, where they're adding a new value, right? So if I were to go ahead and fill out this form right now, here's my new task, right? The email, I guess we could even just capture, okay? And the timestamp, and hit submit. It looks like it writes that value in there, right? And that's only because we're in the builder doing it. If I were to access this app on the public side of things, let me give this a refresh. Okay. And I hit add for a new task. Here's the timestamp and hit submit. You see it shows up here temporarily, right? But if I were to go into the builder, look, it just generates empty data, right? The reason is because a form here can't write to user-specific columns like this on the public side of things. So in this case, if you wanted to make private or personalized tasks, don't use user-specific columns here. Instead, you would just create the row using regular basic columns, and then you would just add row owners to like the email address column of that table. One last thing about user-specific columns is that for the most part, user-specific columns are going to exist in tables that have generic information to them. For example, this global events. Like, let's say I have a list of events, right? They have a start time and end time, right? And we want to see, or we want to allow a user to say that they like or that they're going to a particular event for themselves, right? We could have something that says like RSVP, right? And we could make it user specific in this case, right? These 4 events should appear to every user in the app, but we're going to allow each user to say whether they are going to the event for themselves, to track it for themselves here, right? Now, if you were to use this, it would work for that signed in user. You could use this column here if they say, oh yeah, I'm going to this one, or I'm not going to this one. And you can use these values here to filter or hide or show things in the app. But again, because it's user specific, no other user will see this information. Okay, so user specific columns generally applied to tables with generic or global type events that every user should see, but it allows some sort of personalization. But if you did want this exact same setup where you have 4 events and you want to allow a user to RSVP, but you also want to see who's coming, in that case, you would have to create a log, right? You would create a new table here, call it RSVPs, and you would then track which user is going to which event. You know, something that looks kind of like this, where you have the event, so event 1, and person RSVP'd yes to the event, right? But then you need to determine how you're going to see which user RSVP'd. If it's private, right, then again, you can put row owners on and make it an email address column. But if you want users to see each other's RSVPs, so everybody else can see who's going to the event as well, then you want to capture some sort of non-sensitive information. In this case, maybe a user ID, right? So the user ID of the person that is attending that event, right? So we'd capture like the row ID of the person here like this. So there's nothing in this row that's sensitive anymore, but we can still make relations happen, right? A user can relate to the RSVPs that they're going to, right? The event itself could relate to the RSVPs and see how many people are coming using roll-up columns and all that kind of fun things. So all in all, you're going to place user-specific columns into tables that are typically accessible to everybody, that has just some generic or global information in it, but you want to allow your users to personalize in some way. Any other table where a user is recording something to, like a new task or a new image or a new post, or it's the user profile themselves, and we have their email address recorded as part of that that post, then those don't need to be user specific. You don't need to really use user specific columns in there to identify the user, right? Those you would just place row owners on and call it a day. Now, the last thing I have to mention about row owners is that typically you're going to place it on an email column, right? Glide knows the person that signed in, knows their email address, and so when you place row owners on an email column, Glide can easily find those rows where the email address is there and give access to that data to that user. But there is one other use case for placing row owners on a table that's not the email address, and that's if you're using roles in your app. Now, I created a whole video on demystifying roles and row owners. Go ahead and take a look at that. I'll link it in the description below. But essentially, roles is just a way to give group-based access, right? If you're using row owners on an email column, only one person is going to have access to that row. However, if you want to allow more than one user to access the same row of data, then you can use roles in your app. And the way you do that is in your user profile screen, you specify what your role column is. Again, Glide will start you off with a column called role in the user profile table. And then you can use this one, or if you want to create your own, you can. And then you say what the role is, what the group-based access is, right? There's lots of different use cases for this. One use case is that maybe you want to give an admin access to all of the rows, right? There's two ways to do that. I could create an email column here called admin email, right? And make it an email address column. And let's say this person is the admin, right? I could give the admin access to all of the rows by putting that admin email into every row and then making that a row owner. Okay, that will work if I'm signed in as that person. See, now they have access to all the rows. Okay, but the problem with this is that it's not very flexible, right? If you have 14 admins, you don't want to create 14 columns and make sure that their email address appears in every column. You also don't want to have to do that for every sheet that those admins should be able to access. So instead of using row owners on an email column, you can use row owners on a role column. So here I can give this person access to the role of admin. And then what I can do is I can add a new column here. I usually call it like admin access. And I can just put the word admin, the person's role, in every row and make this a row owner. Okay. And now you see that this person, who I'm signed in as, has access to all of the rows because roles can be row owners. Okay. But if I'm person 1 here, I don't have access anymore. I only have access to my own row because this person is not an admin. So again, this is more flexible because let's say person 2 is an admin, right? That means person 2 then can access all of the rows. Okay, so that's one use case for it. Another use case for roles is, let's say you have an app that's a project management app and you have several different companies using your app and you want to allow each company to see their own projects without any of the other companies having access to any of the data from those companies. So what you could do is you could define the role as the company name, right? Let's create one more person here. This is person 4 at 4.com. Okay. We'll give admin access to the super admin here. Now let's say person 1 and person 2 work for the same company. We can give them the role of company 1. Right? And then maybe person 3 and person 4 work for company 2. Okay, those are their roles. All right. What I could do then is I could make the role column itself row owners. All right. So now if I'm person 2, they have access to each other because they belong to the same company. The role is the row owner in this case. Right? Or if I'm person 3, I have access to any other row that belongs to the same company, that has the same role, right? And maybe all admins then should be able to see each other, right? So here's admin number 2. Admin 2 at gmail.com. Right? That means that if I'm an admin, I can see all of the other admins in addition to everybody else. Okay. So using roles is a strategic way of securing your data as well. So hopefully you learned a little bit more about row owners and user-specific columns and when you would use each in your app. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below, or you can reach out to me at Twitter @rpetito. And as always, thanks for watching.